during the budget workshop, council asked that I prepare alternative budget scenario planning so we can better understand the forecasted potential for forecasting the budget beyond the millage. So in this instance, I went through a process where I scenario planned a budget where we lose about $4 million of property tax revenues that are currently brought in from the Headlee override millage. My goal here is to present an illustrative budget that illustrates a process and how I could approach this and how I would use our tools to approach this by using the program-based budgeting model that we've used. So this is illustrative. I want to be clear about that up front. This is not actual. Should actual budget cuts occur to this magnitude, that would involve a lot of in-depth conversations between City Council, the City Manager's Office, and my staff as well. But by and large, the impacts of this process remain on target. This is what the impact of $4 million would have on the general fund. So to begin, I want to revisit revenues. We're going to talk about revenues first before we get to expenditures. As we just saw, we just adopted a $28.6 million general fund budget. So if I'm in a resident seat at home, I might be asking, what's $4 million on a $28.6 million budget? Impactful, but there's still quite a bit more budget to go. That's 85% budgeted. It's only a 15% reduction. Why the big changes? I want to break that down for you to begin with. I want to use the three-legged stool analogy, and that's really the city general fund. Our stool has three basic routes in which we operate. So the biggest, most robust route, as we've talked about, was property tax revenues. That makes up about 54% of our stable revenues. State shared revenues, we get constitutional and statutory. The statutory revenue sharing is dependent on the city unless nothing, or dependent on the state's legislative process unless something doesn't change. That's about 13% of our revenues. Then we have variable revenues. That's a substantial piece. That's that third leg of the stool. It's very important, but those variable revenues fluctuate up or down based on a lot of the activity from our staff that are funded through the property tax revenues, the stable revenues. Looking at how those revenues shake out, if we distill all those variable revenues, which we'll talk about in a moment, that's 34% of our budget. So that's a substantial variable amount that as a city manager, I'm not going to factor on and rely on as I project out a budget because that's not stable. I'm going to focus on the stability. So what's included in those variable revenues? By and large, mostly fines and fees. Your court is funded mostly through fines and fees. And so those fines and fees are a complete function of the activity of our police department. And then the court adjudicates that. And then those revenues run through the system. Our EMS and ambulance fees, second great contributor, that is a function of our fire department and our EMS services. That is completely reliant on the external calls for service and our ability to respond to that service and then capture the revenue. If we don't respond to that call, we would forego that revenue. So that's a major fluctuation. It's solely reliant on our staffing levels. Zoning review fees, of course, that's going to be reliant on the external environment. So as much as there is building permit activities, zoning interest, or development interest within the city of Ferndale, that's going to be, those revenues are reflecting the time of our CED staff to review those things, so on and so forth. Some of the licensing is state regulated, out of our control. We are a pass-through agent on that, but we do collect it ultimately locally. So that's the liquor license, that's the marijuana licenses for our retail licensing, landlord licensing. As I mentioned, our biggest variable revenue category is $4.3 million in fees and fines. This is based on the adopted budget, and so that history is what I would be basing it off of. As we talked about in grants, a major change between the fiscal 24 and 25 budget were the park grant projects. If there's less staff, there's less grant activity, and so that's a variable revenue that would just go down likely as much as proportions to what we can apply for and what we're successful getting. So summary, why I would isolate these variable revenues and not factor them in? One, predictability and stability. I got to focus on what we can control. We can't control those variable revenues. So much like operations, I always try to focus on just what we can control and do the best with what we got, what we know to be true, our known quantities. Risk management, it's my job to not be risky. And so I'm not going to present you with a budget scenario that's going to leverage that risk. And then long-term planning, we have to rely on stability. That's just the way, as we've talked, that's the way local governments are funded. They're funded by state law to overly rely on property tax revenues and not have alternatives to raise revenues. So now we're going to get to expenditures. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions or comments, concerns about that approach? What I did is take the budget from fiscal 25 that was just adopted, and I excluded that 34%. That takes off about $9.7 million or $10 million in variable revenues. So my functional stable budget is about $18.9 million. Now I cut the Headlee override millage, which is $3.9 million. That would leave me with a stable budget of $15 million for general fund revenues. That would support staff operations, capital infrastructure, and mandated costs. Here you can see two of the legs are reduced substantially, proportionally by about 30%, and that's going to tilt the operation. And the variable revenues leg is a function of the property tax revenue leg. So proportionally, that's going to go up or down. So budget cuts. I'll begin with a quick review of priority-based budgeting. Throughout this program, I'm going to show you the budget cut target on the left, and we're going to walk you through how I approach this using program-based budgeting. So quick basic refresher on program-based budgeting. What council just adopted was a line item budget. That line item budget is structured per state requirement for accounting requirements, as we are required to do. We organize our activities by department, by fund, based on the revenue source. And all of those line items are universal, they're uniform. Every city has the same exact reporting requirement, which makes it easier for the public to generally understand, go to any city, read a budget, and understand what contractual services, and you know where to find that. Doesn't give you any more context than that, so that's where program-based budgeting comes in. So we import the line item budget the council adopted into a software. That software then distributes those line item costs into the programs that are created by the directors. We then correlate the costs of those line items into each program. So now we have richer context. We have programs that are what are really behind the line items, right? And that's what they're really funding. So it's much more rich context. And then we score those programs based on 5 program attributes. 1, is it mandated? Is the city, we just talked about mandates, is the city required to provide a federal state mandate to provide this service? Or is it a local mandate? Did we choose to mandate ourselves? Did we adopt an ordinance like the Police Advisory and Review Board? That's a self-mandate example. Is the demand changing? Is the world changing with demand? Cybersecurity, there's an increase in demand because the world has shifted more towards cloud computing, so that demand might have changed. Printing costs, the demand, I thought changed until I saw our newsletter bill. But if you look at the city's printing and FOIA charges 10 years ago and you look at them now, that's changed. We have discoverable FOIA software now, and people can hopefully help themselves through that process. So the cost of FOIA is not as substantial as it was 10 years ago. That's changed. So those are 2 examples of demand and how demand has changed by function of technology or society. Cost recovery. Does the program provide revenues? At the previous budget meeting, we showed not all departments raise revenues to offset their services. Some do. Some, like the city, the Community and Economic Development Department, their licensing pays for their costs. And community benefit. What proportion of the community is reliant on the program? Some Parks and Rec programs are targeted towards specific interest groups. Those might not be of benefit to 100% of the city of Ferndale's population. Direct benefit, I'll say. And then reliance. Are there other private market alternatives? All of those are weighted equally except mandate. Mandate, because it is a mandate and it's out of our control, ultimately as a city government, my mentor always said, we are creatures of the state, and that's what we are. So we are a function of the state and function of the federal government. We do not have autonomy over them. So if there's a federal or state mandate that is weighted higher as a part of the software program. On the bottom, you can kind of see the sliding scale. You can see the points, 0 on the left and 100 on the right. That is generally the scale of where the programs fall into. The green is going to put you in anything at 66 or greater is going to be in the green, 33 to 66 is in the orange, and 0 to 33 is in the red. This approach does inform the basis of my illustrative budget cuts. So tier 1 program cuts, I'm going to begin with line items, then we're going to provide the layer of context, the layer of programs, what it means. In the first tier of cuts, you have Public Works, Parks and Rec, IT, City Manager, Special Events, all being cut substantially. The Special Events program would be cut itself. So we would cut our Special Events program. Those cuts tally up a total of $800,000 to cut those things. What those line items translate to, that would be the downtown DDA maintenance and beautification services. If the city's Headlee millage is reduced and rolled back, the DDA's is proportionally reduced and rolled back. They also benefit off of the same millage. That would be about a $100,000 budget reduction for the DDA, or about a 20, I think that's at least 20% of their budget. So that would mean that we're probably going to have to do those services differently and probably scale back the value of those services. How that would be done would be negotiated. Our Parks and Rec programs, as you can see on the PBB score, and I want to be clear, this does not indicate value proposition. This is just a reflection of the program-based scoring approach. They are discretionary programs, so therefore they aren't weighted as heavily as the mandated programs. And those would be reduced drastically up front. Your police department professional accreditation is a self-mandate. It is not a state or federal mandate. It is a high priority for the police department. It is also a high priority of city council and me. But it is a function of your staffing mix. To stay on top of accreditation would mean that you pass and prove current policies on a day-to-day basis. And that right now is reliant on one person who audits that and who's responsible for making sure that everyone in the department is compliant on a day-to-day basis. If those resources change, that might be more difficult, and it would be more difficult for us to sustain that accreditation. It is reliant on the staffing mix. You see the special events budget. That is very important, but that is right now a budget that could be outsourced or done in a different way. And we could also reduce that service back. In a time of scarcity, that would be something that would be cut up front. You reduce your technology training management, and these are your other discretionary value add benefits. Obviously, we promote training, we like training, but this is a scarce environment, not a preferred environment. Your leadership program by my office is going to be eliminated as well. And that communications print newsletter, in this scenario, without the funding, we would just be forced to go directly to an e-newsletter. We wouldn't be able to sustain a print newsletter. That also would be likely true of the communications marketing promotions budget. So in that tier cuts, we've eliminated $802,000. That would get us to $3.1 million in the remaining deficit. Are there any questions for the tier 1?
Through the chair, yes. Could you go to the previous slide? Let's talk about I have a couple questions on here.
Okay.
First, could you give some context into what the city manager's leadership development program is?
Yeah, that is a portion of my time. So program-based budgeting allocates personnel time across different programs. Without a fully functional city manager's office, as it states today, you have less resources to dedicate to leadership development. So that is sustaining monthly meetings with 13 directors. That is also going to be part of my leadership initiatives that I do develop. That also is going to be part of leadership development, enrolling staff, especially your managers in transition who are transitioning into a first-time manager job, into any of our resources that we try to promote to help them succeed in that transition.
And the communications print newsletter, actually, let me skip that one for a second. Special events budget. We talk about how special events are funded because I was under the assumption that we had, that our special events were essentially paying for themselves. So Wordwood Dream Cruise, just as an example, has a large budget associated with it that then funds the single personnel that is associated with running special events. Is the assumption here that we eliminate any internal costs, but still allow special events to happen and bring in funding to the city, just manage it differently?
It could be. Special events involves a lot of different resources, so I'll begin by isolating the Dream Cruise. The Dream Cruise as an event does pay for the special events director in itself. The Dream Cruise is unique in that it brings in its own promotional fees and merchandising fees from a more regional event that offset the costs of holding, the city's costs in holding it. The department costs are also factored into the cost of that event. So your police services, your fire services, your public works services, all those costs are submitted to the event as their bill of what they will have to pay for. All of those, our ability to provide special event services as required for police, fire, public works is going to rely on staffing levels and our ability to perform that work overtime on the weekends, which it is overtime work. It's all overtime work. It is not mandated overtime work. So if we have reduction in forces on the police side, fire side, public works side, our ability to staff that from an overtime perspective is virtually eliminated. So I would say, illustratively, I would expect us to probably focus in on 1 to 2 events, one in the spring, one in the fall, that we could possibly organize overtime costs to staff. And the other events will have to be negotiated or discussed.
Okay.
When you say other events, so you talked about the Dream Cruise, but when we talk about, events maybe on a smaller scale, like say Cinco de Mayo or those smaller, can you kind of share the context of those events? Like, would it be more of a staffing thing?
It would be more of a negotiation with the police chief, fire chief, and public works director on a case-by-case basis of whether they have the labor interest and labor ability to actually staff those events with confidence. What's always tricky for us to navigate, even with our staffing levels today, is our back-to-back events. When we have rapid events in August and September, that makes it difficult because you have overtime, staff on overtime for back-to-back weekends, and that is difficult to budget. Also different to keep those staff interested in losing their summer weekends, like their people as well. They have families, they spend their summers. So asking them to book all their weekends working overtime is a tough ask when you have fewer personnel to spread that ask around to.
Through the chair. And if I could add maybe a little bit of clarity too. And I'll use the fire department as an example because they've been a really great example. If we reduce staff, then it forces more of the existing staff to have to take overtime, which a lot of people will say, oh, well, that's great. They're getting, they're making more money. But there's only so much overtime people do want to work. And so you run out of the energy of those leftover staff and they become exhausted and they're not going to want to participate in special events. That's going to be time they're going to want to spend in their family. So you're really squeezing the well dry. When it comes to it. So I understand why I understand why the special events would be cut because you just don't have the remaining staff around to support those events, even with the overtime. And I think you'll end up getting to that a little further in the presentation.
If I might. The Police Department Professional Standards Accreditation. What are the consequences of not doing that? Does that make us less competitive for things like public safety grants, federal funding, state funding? Like what consequence would that have for us?
I actually will ask Chief Emmy to speak to that, in your opinion. I don't want to speak for you. Maybe summarize the top 2 or 3 concerns you would have, or the benefits we have from accreditation.
I think it mostly impacts our commitment to credibility. I think that when it comes to lawsuits, I think that it is in our favor to be accredited. I think it scares away more frivolous lawsuits. This is somewhat anecdotal, but also somewhat confirmed. I think that there is a credibility that is hard to quantify with accreditation. So I feel like we are becoming a little bit more vulnerable. It is something that maybe in the future, if funding or priorities dictate that we go there, we could again reattain accreditation. But we've done a lot of work thus far, and it would be a shame to take a step back. That's, off the top of my head, those are some of the things that come to mind.
Through the chair. I would add that it also takes away from the department's, sort of word I'm looking for, pride. I know that this was something that they really strived for. And to not be able to continue to renew that every year or every 2 years, I think that takes away from the department, from the people within our department.
From my executive viewpoint, the way I looked at it, it's a high priority for me. I think credibility is the right word. It's a reputation issue. And accreditation means we've committed to rigorous standards and rigorous policies that are publicly available to you, and we have to prove that we did that, and we get audited and scored against that. And if we do not meet those rigorous standards, and it's really the burden of proof is on us to prove that we have those standards by daily testing and daily filing, so that when we are audited, we can turn that over. And if we miss on those audits, then we lose points and we're not accredited. And that is reliant on our ability to manage that process. It's robust. There's a reason that less than 50 agencies are accredited. We're one of them. It's a commitment, and it's costly to sustain because it requires committing to it.
I have a question about the newsletter.
Yep.
Is it paid for by the publicity tax?
It could be. It's in the communications budget.
Okay, but it's not necessarily all earmarked?
It's not necessarily earmarked just for that. It's in their budget, and it could be a portion of that. But their notice requirements are also part of that as well. So after the Tier 1 cuts, we've reduced the deficit by $800,000, and we have $3.1 million to go. The next round of budgets is going to focus, you can see a theme, City Hall is going to be reduced substantially. As we've shown, City Hall collectively with the Parks and Recreation budget only makes up about 12% of our expenditures. So there's not a lot of proverbial juice to squeeze from this, but we are squeezing what we can. So from the City Hall cost reductions, you've reduced it by $722,000. What you would eliminate here, I would imagine we would have to reduce our IT help desk standards, and that I just shot that 50%, cut that 50%. I'm not sure if that's available or able in today's labor environment. The city manager's office is going to be reduced by 50%. Our performance management, city administration, and other programs that are handled between the assistant city manager and the city manager are going to have to be reprioritized. Your communications department is also going to be reduced by 50%. Your HR department by a third. I would point out They have 3 positions. One of those positions is largely funded by our pension systems, and they're dedicated to servicing our retirees. And so that position is largely paid for through the pension system.
Through the
And
chair.
they will continue
That-
making those services.
That was the position that saved us over $1 million, right?
That was a position that had a big contribution to that, but that was a team effort. I want to underscore that was a team effort by the department. And then your economic development department will reduce by probably a third. We will focus more internally on community core services and any state regulatory required service. So in this case, your administration is probably active planners. They're doing more planning work than retention work and management work, but they're doing what's required of them, and we would really bolster our community services here. That's going to be your code enforcement, your inspector, and building requirements. So we've reduced City Hall substantially, and that gets us to $2.4 million. So we've, at this point, through the first 2 cuts, I'll just summarize, we eliminated special events. We've reduced City Hall's budget by about 50% to the minimum operating standard. We've also eliminated IT services by 50%. And we're at about $2.4 million to go. So where we haven't really leaned on yet is public works or public safety. But they're really the last places for us to go at this point. We still have $2.4 million to go. That's illustrated here. You can see all the departments not touched, and Tier 3 is going to be public works. And public works is still spread across a lot of their funds, so we're just focusing here on the general services portion. And so here, what I would assume is we would have possibly fewer support in the Public Works Leadership Department or Administration Department, and so that's going to be reduced. We would probably also lose a position in terms of customer service and assistance support, and we will have less funding to make facility infrastructure maintenance, so there's going to be a budget cut there on facility services contracts and facility capital improvements. The same would be true for fleet and infrastructure.
And through the chair, I think it's important to note on that that puts us right back to the problem that we currently have. It doubles down on the problem we currently have, where previously we did not invest in the maintenance and care of our facilities or fleet, which put us in the facilities hole that we're in now. This would just continue to perpetuate that cycle.
I would agree with that. And those bills do come due. When the plumbing fails, we can't close the building. We're going to have to pay for the emergency plumbing repair, and then that potentially could be another service reduction scenario to cover the cost of the facility repair. So we've eliminated another $700,000, and we have $1.6 million still to go to offset that deficit. This, our last remaining place would be public safety, police, and fire. And part of this is to demonstrate, going through this rigorous process, there's really not a way to avoid a public safety cut because they represent such a large component of the general fund budget. As we said, 53% of our budget is police and fire. Looking at the Tier 4 cuts, you would reduce $1 million in police and $700,000 in fire and EMS. That would make up your deficit. What that means is the largest component cost of the police department is going to be your staffing costs, as we discussed. It's 86% of their cost is staffing, and most of that is patrol. So your patrol levels are likely going to go down, which leads to the reduction in overtime and availability to support special events that I talked about. Police admin reductions as well. We talked about this in the previous budget meeting. All of our police command are fully eligible for retirement and a fully funded pension. So I would imagine we'll get some police administration reductions potentially. And if that happens, that could make accreditation responsibility a priority question based on the staffing levels and based on the patrol levels. You also then have a substantially younger department who's really going to need some mentoring attention. So that really could just be reliant on time available to spend with those folks. Your community engagement program is very important, but we're going to have less resources. So we're probably going to dial back our ability to meet our current community engagement levels that we've experienced since Sergeant Brown was first appointed in 2016 or 15. Which means we're going to have to revisit our commitment to the 21st Century Police Task Force. That is still the model we're committed to. We just have to figure out how we can best fit into that model with our current framework. Your fire administration reductions, really the same comment as the police administration levels. Fire training program reductions, that's not a place that we would ever advise cutting, but this is not a current or ideal situation. This is a scarce situation. So this is just a function of that. And the EMS service level reductions, that by far is our greatest call of service for the fire department. We have fewer people responding to fewer calls for EMS. And so I would imagine our service level reductions would go down. Those, again, you see, if you remember, take yourself back to the PBBI score, going from 0 to 100. Red means discretionary, yellow means self-mandate, green means federal funded mandate or state mandate. Here you can see, as we've gone through this process, the scoring goes higher. And so your association with mandate, the last thing I touched was anything that we are federally or state mandated to do or locally mandated to do, if I can avoid that. And so that kind of is a summary walkthrough of my approach for how I went from Tier 1 to Tier 4. I'd also put an asterisk at the bottom of the staffing minimums and service levels will also need to be revisited and negotiated with the administration, our collective bargaining units, in full good faith partnership. So that is a remaining question. But we have eliminated the deficit now at this point. The total net estimated impact. Now, I did not do specific FTE to FTE comparisons. This is illustrative. So I just took the current full-time staffing levels by each department on the left side. You have their staffing reductions based on these cuts. In the middle and on the right, you would have your future full-time budgeted positions. So we're looking at a cut of about 34 full-time employees. We're reducing our full-time workforce from 145 to 111. And as we said in the previous budget, 80% of our workforce is unions. The majority of this is going to be our union employees. Our IT contract at the bottom is reduced by 50%. I don't comment on the Ferndale Courts budget. That's out of my purview. Sustainability, you'll note that the state sustainability is funded by the sanitation fund, not by the general fund, so that service would remain. So I want to get to that, how I got to that full-time, because I imagine people might be asking themselves what's left and why didn't I cut any more at City Hall if I had an opportunity to cut more at City Hall. And that is a good question. That's mostly because we are a charter city, and we, as a charter city, we incorporated in 1927, and what that means, and we've taught this in our Ferndale Learn program, is you are agreeing to certain service standards, and you're agreeing that you prefer local control. You prefer not to have county or state control these things. And so we have said we want to do that. And with local control comes local ordinances, and also local positions to enact and follow up and implement those policies. So on the left, you see the required service. And then you see what the state or Home Rule City Act requires, their minimum requirements. On top of the Home Rule City Act, you have Ferndale's charter, and that's everything that's checked off in the middle. And so all of those positions are accounted for. We still are delivering our finance services. So when you look at the finance full-time positions, they remain intact at 6 positions. That's because all of their positions are either charter-oriented, or they currently only have one position that is responsible for customer service, for processing those charter payments. And so we are keeping that intact. We're not reducing that department. Your city manager, we did reduce the department in half, so you will meet your charter obligation for your city manager, your police chief, and your fire chief, and your public works director. We're required to provide those services. You can see the state is going to require us to oversee some of the regulatory with the building side of things, so we have some levels there. I also did not cut the city clerk department. They only have the city clerk and deputy clerk, since that is a state and federal mandated and local mandate. Checks all the boxes. We want a succession plan there. And finally, the city attorney is also, the division of law is also required as part of the charter. The other note that I would make.
I'm sorry, through the chair.
Sure.
So going back to the last slide, So if the community were to say, well, let's not have a DPW director or, building inspectors, the charter, the voters, the people would have to vote on changing the charter to eliminate those positions. If we wanted to get rid of the, no offense, the police chief, that would have to be a change to the charter voted on by the people.
Correct. And in some cases, a change in the form of government, which is a substantial change.
That as well, yes.
There's other, again, this is from the manager's mindset, and I'm just trying to give you my mindset. I'd look at the annual mandated costs that are substantial. And since I've reduced my budget on the general fund, I'm thinking about of what remains, what's already locked up for an annual mandated cost. And that's talking about our legacy costs. We'll talk about our police and fire pension, minimum contributions, that's $1.6 million to honor our current liabilities. Those liabilities get reassessed by an actuary, and then those liabilities will increase because our workforce is changing. And so we are going to see our current command positions who still are in the pension retire and then draw upon their pensions. So our annual contribution is inevitably going to increase over the next 5 years as our workforce ages out. Retiree healthcare, it's the same thing. Right now, that is estimated in fiscal 26 to cost $1.4 million. And then as a government, we're required to provide general liability insurance for all city property, and that has an annual premium amount of $906,000. We're a self-insured entity. And then, of course, we are a government, so we provide public lighting services, and that's not a cheap bill. That's almost $500,000, which has been reduced since we converted all of our streetlights to LED. So the total annual mandated expenses is about $4.3 million. So the next thing I would do is bring some of that variable revenue back. We just took a heck of a haircut on the general fund budget, but that's not all the variable revenue. So you can see what I've endeavored to do was contrast 2025 variable revenues with 2026 variable revenues. And I simply took a proportional cut to the revenues that I did generally with the staffing. Again, should this actually be done, we would do much more specific, targeted work on that. So the net table, we begin with our 28.6. I extracted the variable costs. We cut the Headlee override millage. We ended up at $15 million for the general fund. I added back 60% of our variable revenues. That gets us to a total projected budget in fiscal 26 of $28.8 million. So it's about a 27% effective budget reduction. And I'd say that's conservative, and that's probably reasonable. Total estimated of that money, of that $20 million, what's discretionary and non-discretionary. 21% of that's non-discretionary. That money's locked in on an annual basis, and that's only going to increase based on our medical and pension obligations. Your discretionary is 16%. That's 79%. And the majority of that's going to be police and fire unless we cut additional services. And that's just the way our budget is structured. Most local governments are structured in Michigan. Now, I've finished that with the alternative scenario as well. If you're going to project one way, I might as well project both ways. And so the Finance Committee recommendation scenario. In this case, the budget would increase by $4.1 million by their recommendation to Headlee override millage to 20 mills. So real quick overview of the millage mechanics. This is broken down in a more effective way, I would say, in their report. So again, I would urge you to go to ferndale.mi.gov and search for the Finance Committee's report. It is available there. By and large, what this would do would be to increase our current millage by 4.4 mils. That would restore it to 20. We just talked in the previous meeting, the value of 1 mil raises $952,000. So very simple math, 952 by 4.4 equals $4.1 million would be raised. The committee then said first priority should be facilities, which we've discussed. This is the debt service modeling that we've obtained from our bond counsel. So $30 million potentially for a public safety facility. We could budget 10 million for a recreation facility and 10 million for the fire station one. That would check off the top 3 recommendations from the 2022 Facilities Task Force report. Doing so, if council did that within a certain amount of time, then once you issue those bonds, you're obligating those funds for debt service. So effectively, the 4.1 mils, or 4.4 mils, I'm sorry, that would be raised are reduced by 3.21 mils right off the rip as soon as you agree to issue bonds for those facilities. So the 4.1 million dollars in new funding is reduced by 3.07 million as soon as council chooses to issue those, should council choose to issue those bonds. That would leave you with 1.1 mils left, or about $1.1 million. Their second priority was staff retention and attraction. We've established we're 80% collective bargaining. We have 5 more unions that are going to be renegotiated next year. We've established that there's a lot of cost pressures on the labor side of things and also on the non-labor side of things. We've established over the past few months publicly, we've talked about the competitive nature of civil recruiting and the state of recruiting for police, fire, and public works. And so our conservative estimate here is the sum value of those 5 contracts, assuming a 3-year term and a minimum 3% annual increase. This excludes the full-time benefits, all the benefits, this is wages, is just over $1 million. So if we renegotiate the contracts with all our staffing levels as they are today, we've just spent the millage on facilities and on 5 contracts. We have $15,000 left. That is not to say that is how council would do it. This again is illustrative as well. And I'm trying to demonstrate the costs of facilities and the costs of labor today. Like most budgets, $4 million doesn't go as far as it did in 2008. And so effectively that millage is potentially used up quick. That was a lot. And so Mayor, turn it over to you for discussion and questions.
This is a presentation. Do we have any questions from audience members, if you'd like to speak? Okay, I'll open it up to council.
So through the chair, this is less of a question to you and more of a question to Greg. How do these cuts stack up against what we had to go through in the past recession when we had to make cuts?
So the level of cuts, the financial was different, but the level of cuts was about the same. We were looking at about a 20% reduction in police and fire. Sorry, I'm looking at the chief. I think it was about that.
Through the chair, we were at 53 prior to are you talking about 2010 cuts?
Yes.
We were at 53 and we went down to like 36.
Yeah.
And now,
42? We're back up to 42?
now we're at 42 and we're suggesting potentially another, I don't know, maybe 8, depending on the scenario where we choose to make those cuts.
Okay. So this millage, the first and the 2015, because the 2015 that was passed really just brought us back to the same level that we were at 2010. We had to make those cuts automatically, even with the passage of the millage. So what you're saying, Chief, is that if it were to be raised to the full 20, we could return to staffing levels prior to 2010?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that. Obviously, costs contractual services and wages and benefits have gone up
Yeah.
exponentially since 2010. I think what the city manager is proposing is that it would maintain current staffing levels and current programming.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Through the chair, I'm suggesting there's no increase to any full-time staffing levels. This is as is today. That'd be your scenario. That could obviously be cut if we choose to make different cuts regardless.
Through the chair. Two things. One, going back to your three-legged stool with the revenue, did you take into consideration, and you may have, I just didn't get the complexity of it, maybe? If you eliminate, for example, a rental inspector, we have two of them. If you eliminate one, you only have one rental inspector doing the same amount of work. You can't expect them to do double. So basically, you're eliminating half of that income as well. If you eliminate a police officer that is issuing tickets, you don't have that person on patrol, so you're eliminating those tickets that that person would have been issuing. Did all of that take into consideration? You did take that into consideration. Okay.
Yeah, that's, visually, that's the tool tipping over, and you can see the variable revenues have been shortened like the property tax revenue. So visually, we show that, but I'd go back to the.
It was
net-
the bar. Was that the blue and the pink bar? That I hate those.
I would focus back on the final table where I add back in those variable cuts. So 60% represents
Okay.
some of that revenue activity. So we weren't whole, right? We lost some money there on the variable.
Okay.
revenues.
So that was taken into consideration. Okay.
Yep.
Now, did you also take into consideration boards and commissions that are not required? For example, the Beautification Commission or the police overview position. Those aren't mandated by the state or the federal government. If we don't have the staff who do most of the work on those commissions and boards,
Yeah.
we're going to have to look at possibly eliminating them as well.
We talked at the beginning about a negotiation with council, and that would be a negotiation between my office and council and re-examining those ordinances to see what staffing levels can support and what extended commitments I can reasonably ask of other departments. So I don't have a specific ordinance, but the bottom line is, yeah, we'd have less staff, so we'd probably be doing boards differently, having more secretaries from the boards themselves, and the staff are just out of it. That's part of the negotiation we'd have to discuss.
Okay.
One of the items that I want to kind of poke at a little bit is it's in the tier 4 reductions. It's the EMS service level reductions.
Sure.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to make a statement and then you can refine it. Our internal service level, like the service level provided by Ferndale's fire department would go down, but residents in Ferndale would not actually see a reduction or a change in their EMS services. We would simply be calling in our co-response partners to cover that gap. Royal Oak, Hazel Park, they would be responding to Ferndale calls if our crews are otherwise occupied or, we don't have the coverage.
Not in the same time. I mean, our department can get there within a couple of minutes. It may take them
Sure.
5 or 10 minutes. So
Sure.
I would say that the service is extremely impacted.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a fair point.
I could say, yes, we have mutual aid agreements, and I wouldn't rely on those. And those partners also have to be willing to make those calls as long as they have the resources and they feel like they're getting equitable return from us on mutual aid, which might be in question. There's a municipality that's had difficulty with that in the north of us in the region, that I won't mention explicitly, but they're having issues with making their contributions to the mutual aid. So mutual aid requires mutual contributions.
Through the chair. One of the things I worry most about is the morale of our staff. You know, if we start really cutting into a lot of the staff, it affects the morale of the people that are left. And let's be honest, we're not public sector doesn't pay as well as private. And there's a lot of people who could say, you know what, it's just not I loved my job, but now it's getting way too much. And then we lose the good people that were left behind. So that's another thing to consider.
I share that concern because, that was the experience for Detroit. They had a massive brain drain. They had to lay off a lot of staff as a result of the insolvency and the bankruptcy. A lot of those folks were gone for good. People with decades of experience and knowledge. And many city departments in Detroit had to rebuild from scratch once bankruptcy was over. I worry about that for Ferndale, that, we go through this, we lose a lot of knowledge, a lot of experienced and dedicated people. And then, maybe the residents change their minds and we later do get the millage override passed, or some other funding resource comes through and we go to reactivate or try to set up some of these services again. And you have to rebuild what was years of effort to get back to what we have in Ferndale, which is, despite the complaining we may see online, some of the best services in this region. We are one of the best cities. People wouldn't be clamoring to live here if we weren't really good at what we do as a city government. I'm not saying we're the best in the world, but we're pretty damn good. And it would be really hard to get back to good if we have this kind of cutback.
Well, if I may, through the chair, Joe, I just want to state that although not favorable, you showed a reality of what we could be facing, and I appreciate that. And it's really something that we all have to think about pertaining to our future revenues.
Takes courage to bring to the council something like this, especially a plan that is going to cut our friends and colleagues' jobs at the end of the day. And so I do appreciate that this was a very difficult task. It means a lot to this body that you undertook it in good faith and transparency with us and the public by doing this.
Appreciate it.
Any other questions from council?
No.
Well, this was informational and eye-opening, but no suggested action is required tonight, so thank you, Joe, for your presentation.